Spoiled billionaires don't expect to hear the word marriage as a threat, but that was exactly the moment Ethan Caldwell realized his life was no longer his own. The crystal chandeliers of the Caldwell estate glowed softly above a room packed with lawyers, executives, and family members who smelled faintly of expensive cologne and old money, and yet the air felt heavy enough to slow every breath. Ethan leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in 32 years, his tailored suit flawless, his dark hair slightly messy in the way magazines called effortless. The family attorney cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before reading the final clause of the late Charles Caldwell's will. If Ethan James Caldwell wishes to inherit controlling shares of Caldwell Group, he must enter into a legal marriage within 30 days. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside the mansion gates. Ethan smirked and shrugged as if the condition were just another minor inconvenience. "Fine," he said lightly, tapping the polished oak table with his knuckle. "Find me someone impressive. Preferably someone who doesn't hate me already." But the lawyer didn't smile. Instead, he slowly turned a page and continued in a steady voice. "The marriage partner has already been selected by Mr. Caldwell prior to his passing. The bride will be Clara Whitmore, daughter of Victor Whitmore." Ethan's smile vanished the second the doors at the far end of the room opened. Clara stepped inside quietly, wearing a simple navy dress that looked modest compared to the glittering suits and designer gowns around her. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her posture calm, her expression composed in a way that suggested she had already heard every insult the world could offer. Ethan stared for a moment before letting out a short laugh under his breath. "You've got to be kidding," he muttered, leaning closer to his cousin as if the whole situation were a private joke. "My grandfather ran a billion-dollar empire, and this was his final idea of comedy." But the lawyer continued without hesitation. "The marriage must remain valid for at least 1 year. Failure to comply will result in the immediate transfer of controlling shares to the board of directors." The words hit the room like a quiet thunderclap. Ethan stood slowly, running a hand through his hair while studying Clara from across the table as if she were a puzzle he refused to solve. She didn't shrink under the attention. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "Trust me, Mr. Caldwell, this arrangement wasn't my idea either." A few executives shifted awkwardly in their seats, pretending to read documents while secretly watching the unfolding drama that could decide the future of the company. Ethan folded his arms and tilted his head slightly, the familiar spark of reckless confidence returning to his eyes. "So let me get this straight," he said with a crooked grin. "If I don't marry you, I lose my company." Clara nodded once. "That's correct." The billionaire heir exhaled slowly, looking around the room at the people who had spent years enabling every spoiled decision he ever made. Then his gaze returned to Clara, lingering longer this time, as if noticing something he hadn't expected. "Well," Ethan said finally, a trace of curiosity slipping into his voice, "I guess we're getting married." The mansion slowly emptied after the meeting, leaving behind the faint echo of expensive shoes against marble floors and the quiet tension of a decision that had already changed several lives. Ethan Caldwell walked out onto the wide stone balcony overlooking the long driveway of the estate, the late afternoon sun stretching across the manicured lawns like a spotlight on everything he had taken for granted. 32 years of privilege had taught him many things about business deals, luxury vacations, and avoiding responsibility, but nothing about being forced into a marriage with a stranger simply to keep the company that carried his last name. He loosened the collar of his shirt and exhaled slowly, watching a black luxury sedan glide down the driveway toward the front gate. Caldwell Group was worth more than $8 billion and controlled everything from real estate towers in Chicago to technology investments in Silicon Valley. Losing it would not just cost him money. It would erase the identity he had been born into. Footsteps approached behind him, light and steady. Ethan did not turn around immediately because he already knew who it was. Clara Whitmore stopped beside the stone railing, standing a few feet away with the calm posture of someone who had prepared for this moment long before he had even heard about it. The wind lifted a few loose strands of her dark hair as the estate gardens stretched quietly below them. Ethan finally glanced at her, studying her face with open skepticism. She did not look like the women who usually appeared in the social columns beside his name. She wore no designer jewelry, no dramatic makeup, nothing that tried to demand attention from the world. "So tell me something," Ethan said slowly, folding his arms against the cool breeze. "What exactly do you get out of this arrangement?" Clara did not answer right away. Instead, she looked out over the property as if measuring something invisible beyond the long rows of trees and fountains. "Security," she said at last. "My father's company has been under pressure for months. Your uncle believes this marriage will strengthen both sides of the family." Ethan laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. "Strengthen the family. That is a polite way of saying I am being traded like a business asset." Clara turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with surprising steadiness. "You are not the only one being traded, Mr. Caldwell." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the leaves in the gardens below, while the distant sound of a helicopter crossed the skyline somewhere over the city. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and looked down toward the marble courtyard where his sports car sat parked like a reminder of the life he might lose. The board of directors had tolerated his reckless reputation because the Caldwell name still brought power and profit. Without the controlling shares promised in his grandfather's will, that protection would vanish overnight. He would become just another wealthy man with a fading inheritance and no real authority. "1 year," Ethan said quietly, repeating the clause from the will. "That is how long we have to pretend." Clara nodded once. "Appear together in public. Attend company events. Maintain the image of a stable marriage." Ethan studied her again, this time more carefully, as if looking for signs that she might secretly be enjoying the situation. Instead, he found only calm determination. It was the expression of someone who understood that survival sometimes required uncomfortable decisions. "You realize this is going to be miserable," Ethan said with a crooked smile. Clara did not smile back. "Only if we make it that way." Ethan stared at the horizon for a long moment before letting out a quiet breath. The future he had imagined that morning was already gone. In its place stood a strange partnership with a woman he barely knew and a contract that could decide the fate of an entire empire. Finally, he pushed away from the railing and looked at her again. "All right," he said. "If we are going to do this, we do it my way first. Absolute honesty. No games. No pretending that this is anything more than a deal." Clara held his gaze without hesitation. "That works for me." Ethan gave a small nod, though somewhere in the back of his mind a strange thought lingered, one he could not quite explain. For the first time since the lawyer had read the will, he had the uneasy feeling that the woman standing beside him might not be as simple as everyone believed. 3 weeks later, the quiet agreement made on the balcony had turned into a carefully choreographed reality that neither Ethan Caldwell nor Clara Whitmore had fully expected. The wedding itself was not extravagant by Caldwell standards, but it was still the kind of ceremony that appeared on the front page of business magazines across the country. The event took place in the glass atrium of the Caldwell Tower in downtown Chicago, 40 floors above the busy streets where the city stretched for miles in every direction. White roses lined the aisle, and the Chicago River glimmered far below through the towering windows as reporters gathered outside, hoping to capture a glimpse of the unexpected union that had suddenly secured the future of Caldwell Group. Ethan stood at the front beside the officiant wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that looked as expensive as the building itself, but the confident billionaire who usually dominated every room felt strangely restrained today, as if invisible walls had closed in around him. When the music began and Clara stepped into the room, the quiet murmur of the guests softened into curious whispers. She wore a simple ivory dress with long sleeves and no dramatic jewels, nothing like the glamorous celebrity weddings Ethan had attended in the past. Yet there was something steady in the way she walked toward him that drew attention without asking for it. Her expression was calm and thoughtful rather than nervous, and Ethan noticed that she did not once look toward the photographers or the executives watching from the first rows. She looked only forward, focused on the moment as if it were simply another decision she had already accepted. As she reached the front of the aisle, their eyes met briefly, and Ethan felt the same strange curiosity that had lingered since the meeting at the mansion. The officiant spoke about commitment and partnership, while the city hummed quietly beyond the glass walls of the tower, and Ethan listened with only half his attention because the reality of the situation felt both surreal and strangely permanent. When the time came to exchange vows, they kept their words short and respectful, exactly as their lawyers had advised. Ethan slipped the ring onto Clara's finger with careful precision while cameras flashed from the far end of the atrium. It was a small circle of platinum, simple and elegant, a symbol that looked more meaningful than the contract that had actually brought them together. Clara placed a matching ring on Ethan's hand, and for a brief moment the two of them stood facing each other in silence before the officiant declared them husband and wife. Applause filled the room as executives, board members, and family guests stood from their seats, but Ethan noticed that Clara did not react with excitement or relief. Instead, she gave a small polite nod to the audience and turned slightly toward the windows as if acknowledging the vast city that now watched their new partnership begin. Later that evening, after the reception had ended and the last reporters had left the tower, Ethan returned to the penthouse apartment that overlooked Lake Michigan, a place that had always felt like a personal sanctuary above the chaos of the city. Tonight the space felt different. Clara entered quietly a few minutes later carrying a single suitcase, her footsteps echoing softly across the polished wood floors as she studied the modern living room and the panoramic view beyond the glass walls. Ethan loosened his tie and leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her with the cautious curiosity of someone who had just invited a stranger into the center of his life. "Welcome home," he said lightly, although the words sounded unfamiliar even to him. Clara placed the suitcase beside the sofa and glanced around the room before meeting his gaze again. "Thank you," she replied calmly. Ethan folded his arms and considered the situation for a moment before speaking again. "Just so we are clear," he said, repeating the understanding they had established weeks earlier, "this is still a partnership. Public appearances, business dinners, family events. Nothing more." Clara nodded once without hesitation. That was the agreement. Ethan walked toward the windows where the lights of Chicago stretched across the dark water of the lake, and for a moment, he wondered how long such a carefully controlled arrangement could truly last. Behind him, Clara moved quietly through the penthouse, as if already memorizing the rhythm of a life she had only just entered. Neither of them said another word, but the silence between them carried a strange awareness that the contract binding them together might soon become something far more complicated than either of them had planned. Morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse as the city of Chicago slowly came to life below, the distant sound of traffic blending with the quiet hum of the lake beyond the glass. Ethan Caldwell was already dressed in a charcoal gray suit, scrolling through market reports on his tablet, while a cup of untouched coffee cooled on the marble kitchen island. Normally mornings began with calls from investors or invitations to exclusive parties, but today there was a new rhythm in the apartment. Clara Whitmore moved quietly through the kitchen wearing a simple cream sweater and dark trousers, her hair tied back as she prepared breakfast with the calm focus of someone completely comfortable in unfamiliar territory. Ethan glanced up from the screen when the smell of fresh coffee replaced the bitter scent from his abandoned cup. Clara set a new mug beside him without saying anything and took a seat across from him at the long dining table that overlooked Lake Michigan. The silence between them was not hostile, just careful, like two people learning the boundaries of a shared space. After a moment, Ethan cleared his throat and set the tablet down. "You do not have to play the role of perfect wife at breakfast," he said casually. Clara looked up from her plate and gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I am not playing a role. I wake up early, and I like coffee." Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her again with the same curiosity that had been growing since the wedding. She had spent 3 days in the penthouse now and had not asked for designer clothes, expensive jewelry, or anything that usually appeared on the wish lists of the women he had dated before. Instead, she had quietly read financial newspapers at night and walked along the lakefront early in the morning before the city crowds arrived. Later that morning, they arrived at Caldwell Tower together for the first time as a married couple. The lobby of the 70-story building buzzed with the usual energy of assistants, analysts, and executives rushing toward elevators while giant digital screens displayed the company's latest stock performance. Conversation slowed as people noticed Ethan walking beside Clara. Some employees smiled politely, while others exchanged surprised glances, clearly unsure what to make of the woman who had suddenly become part of the Caldwell legacy. Ethan stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, where the boardroom waited like the center of the company's power. Clara stood beside him, quietly watching the numbers climb as the elevator rose higher and higher above the busy streets. When the doors opened, several board members were already seated around the long glass table, discussing a quarterly report. Victor Whitmore stood near the window speaking to two senior executives, his confident posture revealing the satisfaction of a man who believed his plan had worked perfectly. The moment he saw Clara, he smiled with polite approval and gestured toward an empty chair near the end of the table. Ethan moved toward the head of the table, and the room quickly settled into attentive silence. The presentation began with charts showing declining numbers in one of Caldwell Group's technology divisions, a problem the executives had been debating for weeks without finding a clear solution. Ethan listened with mild impatience as different managers suggested cautious adjustments that sounded more like delays than real strategies. Then something unexpected happened. Clara leaned forward slightly and studied the large screen where the financial data was displayed. "Excuse me," she said calmly, her voice quiet but clear enough to interrupt the discussion. The room turned toward her with mild surprise. Ethan raised an eyebrow as if wondering what she might possibly add to a conversation about a multi-billion-dollar division. Clara pointed to one of the charts showing declining sales across several states. "This pattern is not random," she said thoughtfully. "It shows a shift in consumer behavior in the Midwest region. If Caldwell redirects the product rollout strategy and focuses on subscription-based services instead of direct licensing, the revenue curve should stabilize within 2 quarters." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried genuine attention. One of the senior analysts quickly typed numbers into a laptop and glanced up with visible surprise. "That projection actually aligns with several trends we have been tracking," he admitted. Ethan looked at Clara, the familiar confidence in his expression replaced for a moment by genuine curiosity. She had spoken without hesitation and without the slightest hint of insecurity. Victor Whitmore watched the exchange carefully from across the room, his expression thoughtful, as if realizing that the quiet woman he had placed into the Caldwell family might possess more influence than he had originally expected. Ethan leaned back in his chair and studied Clara again, the same strange feeling returning that had first appeared on the balcony weeks earlier. The contract between them was supposed to be simple and temporary, yet something about the way she had just changed the direction of the conversation made him wonder if the next year of his life was about to become far more complicated than a simple business arrangement. The discussion in the boardroom did not end quickly after Clara spoke. Several executives leaned forward, studying the charts again, while the senior analyst adjusted the financial projections on the large digital screen. Ethan Caldwell remained silent at the head of the table, his fingers lightly tapping the glass surface as the numbers shifted in real time. Within a few minutes, the new model appeared on the screen, and the change was impossible to ignore. The predicted losses that had worried the board for weeks slowly flattened into a steady recovery curve that stretched across the next 2 fiscal quarters. A quiet murmur moved around the room as several board members exchanged impressed glances. One of the directors, a gray-haired investor who rarely showed emotion during meetings, adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Clara. "Miss Whitmore, have you worked in market analysis before?" Clara shook her head slightly, remaining calm despite the sudden attention. "Not officially," she replied. "But consumer behavior tends to follow predictable patterns when technology adoption shifts across regions." The analyst nodded slowly. "She is correct about the trend. Our internal reports suggested something similar, but we did not restructure the rollout strategy." Ethan watched the exchange carefully, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. A few weeks earlier, he would have dismissed the idea that the quiet woman beside him could influence a discussion about one of the company's largest divisions. Now he was beginning to realize that he might have underestimated her completely. Across the table, Victor Whitmore folded his hands calmly, though the slight tension in his posture suggested he had not expected Clara to take such an active role so quickly. The meeting eventually moved on to other topics, but the atmosphere had subtly changed. Several executives who had barely acknowledged Clara earlier now addressed her respectfully when discussing projections or regional strategies. When the session finally ended, the board members began leaving the room in small groups, still discussing the unexpected shift in the company's plan. Ethan remained seated for a moment, staring at the digital screen where the new revenue curve still glowed against the dark background. Clara gathered her notes quietly and stood to leave when Ethan spoke. "You could have mentioned that you understood business strategy," he said calmly. Clara paused beside the chair and looked at him. "You did not ask." Ethan gave a small amused breath and stood as well. Together they walked toward the executive elevator, the polished hallway reflecting the afternoon sunlight pouring through the tower's massive windows. When the elevator doors closed behind them, the noise of the office floors disappeared, leaving only the soft mechanical hum as the car descended toward the lobby. Ethan finally turned toward her with genuine curiosity. "Most people in that room have spent 20 years building their careers in corporate finance," he said. "You solved their problem in less than 2 minutes." Clara shrugged lightly. "Sometimes people stare at the numbers too long and forget to ask why the numbers changed." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into the lobby where employees hurried across the marble floor carrying laptops and folders. Several of them glanced toward Clara with new interest now that word of the boardroom moment had already begun to spread through the building. Ethan noticed the subtle shift immediately. Respect in a company like Caldwell Group usually took years to earn, yet somehow Clara had created it in a single conversation. Later that evening, the couple attended a charity reception hosted on the rooftop garden of a luxury hotel overlooking the Chicago skyline. The event gathered investors, journalists, and social leaders who had supported Caldwell Group's philanthropic programs for years. String lights glowed across the open terrace while the city lights shimmered across Lake Michigan in the distance. Ethan moved easily through the crowd, greeting familiar faces with the relaxed confidence that had always defined his public image. Clara stayed beside him, listening more than speaking as conversations flowed around them about business partnerships and economic forecasts. At one point, a reporter approached and asked politely how married life was treating the newly formed Caldwell partnership. Ethan opened his mouth to respond with one of his usual charming remarks, but before he could speak, Clara answered calmly. "We are still learning," she said with a small, thoughtful smile. "Good partnerships take time." The reporter nodded and wrote something into a small notebook before moving on to another guest. Ethan glanced at Clara with a mixture of amusement and surprise. "You handled that well," he admitted quietly. Clara looked out over the skyline where thousands of lights spread across the dark horizon. "It is not difficult," she replied. "People only believe what they expect to see." Ethan followed her gaze across the city, and for the first time since the marriage contract had begun, he felt a faint shift in his perspective. The arrangement had started as a strategic obligation, a one-year performance designed to protect an empire worth billions of dollars. Yet as he watched the calm confidence in Clara's expression, he could not ignore a growing realization. The woman standing beside him was no longer just part of a contract. She was quietly becoming one of the most intriguing forces in his life. The rooftop reception slowly faded into the quiet rhythm of the night as guests drifted toward the elevators and the waiters began clearing the final glasses from the tables. The Chicago skyline stretched endlessly beyond the terrace, a sea of lights reflecting across Lake Michigan while a cool breeze moved gently through the garden above the hotel. Ethan Caldwell stood near the railing with his hands resting lightly on the polished metal edge, watching the distant movement of boats across the dark water far below. Normally events like this energized him. He was used to conversations about investment deals, luxury resorts, and new ventures that promised another surge in the Caldwell fortune. But tonight his attention kept drifting back to the woman standing a few feet away from him. Clara Whitmore had stepped aside from the crowd and was quietly looking across the skyline, as if the vast city beneath them held more interest than the dozens of influential guests who had spent the evening trying to impress her. Ethan turned toward her slowly, noticing details he had overlooked before. The soft glow from the terrace lights reflected gently against her face, while the wind brushed loose strands of her dark hair across her shoulder. She looked calm, almost peaceful, as if the enormous pressure of their unusual marriage had somehow settled naturally into her life. "You handled tonight better than most executives I know," Ethan said after a moment, his voice quieter now that the crowd had thinned. Clara glanced toward him with a small, thoughtful expression. "Public events are simply conversations with more people listening," she replied. Ethan gave a faint smile and leaned against the railing beside her. Most people spend years learning how to do that without saying the wrong thing. Clara looked back toward the city lights again. Sometimes people are more honest when they forget they are supposed to perform. The comment lingered between them as the wind moved gently across the rooftop garden. Ethan studied her profile again, noticing the quiet confidence that seemed completely natural to her. It was different from the rehearsed charm he had seen in countless business leaders and social figures. Clara did not appear to be trying to impress anyone. She simply existed in the moment with a steady sense of calm that made the entire environment around her feel different. After a few seconds, Ethan spoke again, his tone softer than before. "You surprised everyone in that boardroom today," he said. Clara gave a small shrug. "It was just an observation." Ethan shook his head slightly. "No, that was more than an observation. You changed the direction of a division that brings in hundreds of millions of dollars each year." Clara turned toward him fully this time, and for a brief moment her calm expression shifted into something more reflective. "Numbers are just stories," she said quietly. "They show what people choose and what they avoid. If you listen long enough, the patterns become obvious." Ethan looked at her for a long moment without speaking. In the past few weeks, he had begun to realize that Clara Whitmore did not fit into any of the assumptions he had made about her. She was not intimidated by wealth. She did not seek attention, and she had quietly proven herself capable of influencing decisions that affected thousands of employees across the country. Yet there was still something he did not understand about her. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Ethan said finally. Clara nodded slightly. "Why did you agree to this marriage so quickly? You could have refused. Your father might have found another solution." Clara rested her hands lightly against the railing as she looked out across the lake again. The city lights shimmered across the water while distant traffic hummed far below the towering hotel. For several seconds, she did not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quieter tone than before. "When people grow up being underestimated," she said slowly, "they learn that sometimes the best opportunity is the one everyone else believes is a mistake." Ethan felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere between them. The words sounded simple, yet they carried the weight of a deeper story she had not fully revealed. He turned slightly toward her, curiosity replacing the casual confidence he usually wore in public. "Underestimated," he repeated thoughtfully. Clara nodded once, her gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. "Most of my life people decided who I was before they ever asked what I could do." The wind moved across the terrace again as the final guests disappeared into the elevators behind them. Ethan remained beside her in the quiet rooftop garden, watching the reflection of city lights across the water while a new awareness slowly formed in his mind. The woman he had once assumed was simply part of a contract was becoming something far more complicated. And for the first time since their unusual marriage began, Ethan Caldwell realized he was no longer certain who truly held the advantage in the arrangement. The following week, the calm rhythm that had slowly formed between Ethan Caldwell and Clara Whitmore began to shift in ways neither of them fully anticipated. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass walls of Caldwell Tower as employees filled the elevators and the financial district outside buzzed with its usual weekday energy. Inside the executive floor, the atmosphere carried a different tension. News from the previous board meeting had quietly spread through the company, and more people were beginning to recognize Clara not simply as the billionaire heir's wife, but as someone whose ideas were influencing real decisions. Ethan noticed it first during a strategy briefing that afternoon. Several department heads directed questions toward Clara when discussing consumer trends, something that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. She answered each question calmly, without seeking attention, yet the quiet confidence in her voice gradually shifted the tone of the room. Ethan leaned back in his chair watching the exchange with mixed curiosity and unease. For years he had been the unquestioned center of every meeting, the natural leader of Caldwell Group even when his decisions were impulsive. Now the focus of the room seemed to drift naturally toward the woman sitting 2 seats away from him. Across the table, Victor Whitmore observed the dynamic carefully. The older man maintained his usual composed smile, but there was a calculating sharpness behind his eyes as he watched Clara speak with the senior analysts. Victor had always believed he understood the balance of power within the Caldwell family. What he was witnessing now suggested the balance might be shifting. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the penthouse alone after finishing several calls with investors on the West Coast. The sky above Lake Michigan had turned a deep violet as the last colors of sunset faded into the horizon. He poured a glass of sparkling water and stepped toward the windows, replaying the day's meetings in his mind. The company was stabilizing faster than expected after adopting the new strategy Clara had suggested. Analysts were already predicting stronger quarterly results. By any logical measure, it was good news. Yet the feeling in Ethan's chest was not entirely comfortable. He had spent most of his life believing success came from confidence and control. Clara seemed to influence events without either of those things. A quiet click echoed from the front door as Clara entered the penthouse a few minutes later carrying a slim folder. She set it on the dining table and removed her coat while the city lights reflected softly across the windows behind her. Ethan turned toward her. "Working late again?" he asked. Clara nodded. The technology division asked for additional projections. She opened the folder and placed several printed reports on the table. Ethan walked closer and glanced at the documents, noticing detailed financial models and market forecasts that looked far more sophisticated than the average internal report. "You prepared all of this today?" he asked. Clara looked slightly surprised by the question. "Yes." The analyst wanted to confirm the timeline for the new rollout strategy. Ethan studied the charts again, his expression slowly tightening with realization. These were not casual observations or lucky guesses. The reports showed a deep understanding of long-term corporate planning. "Clara," he said carefully, "how exactly do you know how to do all of this?" For the first time since he had known her, she hesitated before answering. "I studied economics," she said simply. Ethan waited, sensing there was more she was not saying. Clara looked toward the city lights for a moment before continuing quietly. "And I worked in strategic consulting for several years." Ethan felt the weight of the revelation settle in the room. That detail had never appeared in any of the information Victor had presented when the marriage arrangement was announced. Before Ethan could respond, a sharp vibration echoed from his phone on the kitchen counter. A new notification flashed across the screen from a major financial news outlet. Ethan picked up the device and read the headline slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to sudden disbelief. The article displayed a photograph of Clara taken earlier that evening outside Caldwell Tower. Beneath the image, bold text revealed information that neither Ethan nor most of the business world had known until that moment. Clara Whitmore was identified as the former co-founder of a technology startup that had been sold 2 years earlier for nearly $80 million. Ethan looked up from the screen, stunned, as Clara quietly watched him from across the room. In the silence that followed, the carefully balanced agreement between them suddenly felt far more complicated than either of them had imagined. The silence in the penthouse lingered long after Ethan Caldwell lowered the phone from his hand. The city lights outside shimmered across Lake Michigan, while the financial article remained frozen on the screen, the headline glowing like a challenge he had not expected to face. Clara Whitmore stood near the dining table, her posture calm, but her eyes steady as she watched him process the information. Ethan slowly set the phone down on the counter, the polished marble reflecting the tension in his expression. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the city below seemed louder than usual. Finally, Ethan exhaled and ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign that his usual confidence had been shaken. $80 million, he said slowly, repeating the number as if it might somehow change the meaning of what he had just read. Clara did not react with pride or excitement. Instead, she folded her hands gently in front of her and answered with the same calm tone she always used. "The company was sold 2 years ago." Ethan studied her with new intensity. "And you never thought that detail might be important to mention before we got married?" Clara met his gaze without flinching. "You never asked about my past," she replied quietly. Ethan let out a short breath, half disbelief and half frustration. For weeks he had assumed she entered the marriage from a position of weakness, someone who needed the security of the Caldwell name. Now the entire narrative had flipped in an instant. "My uncle told me your family needed this marriage," Ethan said, the realization spreading across his mind. Clara's expression softened slightly, not with amusement, but with something closer to understanding. "My father did need stability for his company," she explained. "But that does not mean I needed the money." Ethan walked toward the window again, staring out at the endless grid of lights stretching across the city. His thoughts raced through the past few weeks, replaying every conversation with Clara and every assumption he had made about her role in the arrangement. Suddenly those moments looked completely different. The quiet intelligence in her comments during the board meeting, the way she analyzed market trends with effortless clarity. None of it had been accidental. Behind him, Clara spoke again, her voice steady but thoughtful. "I did not hide my experience to deceive you," she said. "I simply did not see a reason to introduce myself with it." Ethan turned back toward her slowly. "Most people would have used that success as their entire identity," he said. Clara gave a small reflective smile. "That is exactly why I chose not to." The words settled into the room with surprising weight. Ethan leaned against the counter, studying her more carefully than ever before. For the first time since the marriage contract began, he felt something unfamiliar replacing the skepticism that had guided his view of her. Respect. Yet the situation remained complicated. The financial article was already spreading across media platforms, and by morning the entire business world would know the truth about Clara Whitmore. "The board will see this story tomorrow," Ethan said. Clara nodded. "Yes." Ethan glanced back at his phone where new notifications were already appearing from reporters requesting comments. "They will assume you married into Caldwell Group to gain influence." Clara's gaze shifted briefly toward the skyline before returning to him. "People will believe whatever version of the story fits their expectations." Ethan was about to respond when another message flashed across the screen. This one was not from the press. It was from Victor Whitmore. The short text message appeared simple, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. The message read that the board had scheduled an emergency meeting the following evening to discuss recent developments involving Clara and the future leadership of Caldwell Group. Ethan looked up from the phone slowly as the weight of the situation settled over him. The quiet partnership that had been slowly forming between him and Clara was about to face its first real test. And for the first time since the strange marriage began, Ethan Caldwell realized the next move would determine far more than the terms of a one-year contract. The next evening, Caldwell Tower glowed against the Chicago skyline, like a monument to power and expectation. Inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual as directors and senior investors gathered around the long glass table. Financial news screens on the walls quietly replayed the story that had spread across the business world overnight. Clara Whitmore's past success had become headline material, and speculation about what it meant for the future of Caldwell Group had filled every financial channel in the country. Ethan Caldwell stood near the window before the meeting began, looking down at the streets far below where the city moved with its usual restless energy. Normally, a board meeting felt like familiar territory to him. But tonight something deeper was at stake. Across the room, Clara sat calmly at the table reviewing several printed reports, her posture composed despite the curious glances from the directors. When Victor Whitmore entered the room, the quiet conversations faded immediately. The older man walked confidently to the head of the table and addressed the board with his usual polished tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the situation we face today is not a crisis," he began, folding his hands together. "However, the recent media coverage raises questions about leadership perception and the future direction of our company." Several board members nodded thoughtfully. Victor turned his gaze toward Clara with a measured expression. "Miss Whitmore, your accomplishments are impressive, but they were not disclosed before this marriage arrangement. The board must evaluate whether this new information changes the strategic balance within Caldwell Group." The room remained silent as every eye shifted toward Ethan. The decision to speak first belonged to him as the primary heir of the company. For a moment, he simply looked around the table at the people who had watched him grow up inside the empire his grandfather built. Then he stepped forward slowly and rested both hands on the glass surface of the table. "You are right about one thing," Ethan said calmly. "The situation has changed." Victor's expression tightened slightly as he waited for the rest of the statement. Ethan glanced briefly toward Clara before continuing. "When this marriage began, I believed it was simply a condition of my grandfather's will. A temporary partnership designed to protect the company." He paused for a moment and looked directly at the board members around him. "But over the past weeks, I have watched Clara analyze market trends faster than our senior consultants, stabilize a division that was losing millions of dollars, and earn the respect of executives who have worked here for decades. The room remained completely quiet. Ethan straightened slightly and spoke with a level of clarity that surprised even himself. The board does not need to question her influence on this company, he said. You should be asking how we were fortunate enough to gain it. Victor's confident posture faltered for the first time that evening. Several directors exchanged thoughtful glances while the senior analyst seated near the end of the table nodded slowly in agreement. Clara looked toward Ethan with quiet surprise, clearly not expecting such a direct defense. Ethan continued, his voice steady. Caldwell Group does not need less leadership. It needs better leadership. And if this board is serious about the future of this company, then you should consider the possibility that my wife might be one of the most valuable strategic minds in this room. A long silence followed as the weight of his words settled across the boardroom. Finally, one of the senior directors spoke. Mr. Caldwell, the man said thoughtfully, are you suggesting a formal leadership role for Mrs. Caldwell within the company? Ethan looked toward Clara again before answering. Yes, he said simply. Because the smartest decision I have made since this marriage began is realizing I should stop underestimating her. Clara remained still for a moment before slowly rising from her chair. The tension that had filled the room seemed to soften as several directors nodded in approval. Outside the glass walls of the tower, the city lights stretched endlessly across the horizon. And for the first time since the unusual marriage contract began, Ethan Caldwell understood something he had never expected to learn. The arrangement that started as a forced obligation had quietly turned into the beginning of a partnership neither of them had planned, but both of them were now ready to embrace.